Welcome to the program. Today, it's just you and me. No guests this week, no guests today. We are diligently working on getting our first guest booked for this program. And I really wanted to make the debut episode a great interview with one of our world renowned experts that we're working on getting scheduled. But I felt like you and I, the audience, we need to build a little bit of a bond and a relationship before we start bringing in guests to this program. And so I wanted to give you a little flavor for how I think, what the things that I think about, and the things you can expect from this show going forward. And I do want this fundamentally to be an interactive community. More than anything else, I want to hear from you. And in order for me to hear from you, I need to put out some ideas, put out some thoughts, and get back from all of you your perceptions, your ideas, your thoughts. This is how we're going to get to know one another. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go back to episode 0, the pilot of this program, where I introduce myself and I share a little bit about my background, why I'm doing this show, what I hope to get out of it. So today, we're going to leap right into topic number 1. And it is President's Day week in 2023 here in the United States. And I welcome listeners from around the world listening to this program for the first time, perhaps. And I wanted to share some of my thoughts about the American presidency, what the office has become, how unwieldy it is, and the implications it has both here in the United States, but also around the world. So I'm going to take a few minutes here to share some of my thoughts, but importantly, most importantly, I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts. So I will remind you of all this again at the end of the program. But if you don't already know, you can learn more about this show, brianjmatos.com. All of our episodes will be available there. You, of course, can download this show wherever you get your podcasts. You can reach out to me directly with your thoughts and comments and questions, and I will answer them on this program. If you want to email me, it's info, at brianjmatos.com. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at brianjmatos. If you prefer Facebook, you can message me there. My Facebook handle is brian.matos. You can also find me on Instagram, Brian J. Matos, and on YouTube at the Brian J. Matos Podcast, at Brian J. Matos Podcast. Those are all the places that you can interact with me. Take your pick, take your choice. I will love to hear from you anywhere and everywhere. So let's get into the topic of the day, the American presidency, what it is, what it has become. There was an article, actually a TED Talk, a TED article several years ago, back in 2017, that I was researching as I was thinking about this topic from Jeremy Suri. And it was a fairly straightforward article about how unwieldy the presidency has become and some of the ideas that this particular author had for making it easier, for making it better to serve the American people, and frankly, given how important the United States is around the world, to serve the entire international community better. Let me make a couple of important points about the nature of the American presidency. It is very much by design not meant to be royalty. It's not meant to be a Caesar or a czar, as the Russians would call it. It's not meant to be an all-powerful emperor. It is a democratically elected office that has significant limitations placed upon it by the legislative branch of Congress here in the U.S. and the Supreme Court, the judicial and the legislative branches, which constrain the office of the presidency. It is also important to note that in the United States, the federal government itself is in many ways constrained by the Constitution about what it can and can't do, from the chief executives all the way down to cabinet officials and individual officers of the federal government. And we are fundamentally a nation of 50 states and several territories, each of whom has their own chief executive with important responsibilities at the state level that act sort of like mini presidents. But there are, of course, things like national security that they cannot handle on their own, or major national disasters that require a more unified multi-state response. Even interstate commerce, interstate travel requires a coordination that the governors in and of themselves may have a difficult time doing if it was just left up to them. So there are already limits on the presidency, and I don't know if everybody outside the U.S. or even inside the U.S. fully appreciates that the president is not an all-powerful, all-encompassing office. They already have institutional limits placed upon whoever is in that seat. But with that having been said, the responsibilities that any American president is burdened with are overwhelming for even the most qualified of all people in this country. No matter how well educated you are, no matter what background you come from, no matter how adept and how skillful of a senior leader you have been in a previous life, whether it was political, whether it was public or private, whether it was leading a major enterprise or whether it was leading a community or even a state. There is no job in the world that could possibly prepare any single person for the responsibilities that come with that office every single day. And it shouldn't be surprising that no matter who is in that seat, they face constant criticism, both from their own political party, of course, from the opposition party, and from the general public that isn't particularly political most of the time. But everyone has their own needs, their own desires, and they project all of their problems onto this one individual. I think it's important for everybody outside the U.S. to understand, too, that the one trait that the American presidency has that's similar to what you see with royalty or with dictators or authoritarians in other countries is this idea that the president, whoever it is for that time the personification of the country that elected them. So here in the United States today, we have President Joe Biden. We had President Donald Trump for 4 years. We had President Barack Obama for 8 years. We had President George W. Bush for 8 years. And in those times, those 8-year or 4-year increments, many people around the world associated the individual in the office with the personification of America at that time. And of course, this is not necessarily true, and it's not meant to be that way. And yet, even we Americans oftentimes look at that individual as if they represent the entirety of the country and all of the diversity of our views, all the diversity of our backgrounds. And of course, no one person can possibly do that, nor do they wield the power that authoritarians or dictators or kings or czars do in other countries where they are, for better or worse, more or less the personification of their people because they have to be, because they force their people into believing the things that they espouse. So, as you think about that aspect alone, you're asking a single person to be the personification of all the people in the country. We have to get away from that. And we need our presidents, both those who are in office in the past and those who are running in the future, to start level setting the expectation that we are here to represent all Americans, yes. But it's not valuable to project all of your hopes and dreams and everything you are ever want to be onto this one individual. Getting away from that projecting is important to make the presidency a little more down to earth and realistic into what it is, what it can be, and what it should be. Now, let's talk about probably the single most important element that makes the American presidency difficult, and that is the combination of the role of commander in chief with authority for all U.S. military operations short of formal declarations of war. But let's be honest, in the U.S., Congress has largely abdicated their responsibilities in that regard. But constitutionally, the president should not be able to just send the military anywhere in the world without the authority of Congress. And because the president is the commander in chief, and because they are the head of state, they are responsible for America's foreign policy and its interactions with every other country in the world, from the largest to the smallest. And while there is an enormous State Department and diplomatic corps and international footprint of ambassadors and junior staffers and agencies, the fact that the American president is the most powerful world leader because they are commander in chief of the most powerful military in the world, and because they oversee the most important country in international affairs, because whatever America does, even if it's a hiccup, has huge implications for every other country, every other region, every alliance. We fund every major international organization, from the United Nations to NATO to the USAID program to the World Health Organization. The United States is the indispensable country in the world, which makes the American president uniquely important in international affairs. That job alone is an enormous task that would be overwhelming for any one person, no matter their background. But when you consider that many of America's recent presidents, the current president being one notable exception, had little to no practical foreign policy making experience, had not served in an office that had international facing roles, or had such a thin experience with international affairs that they truly didn't understand even the basic complexities of the world that they were now stepping into an indispensable leadership role for. At the same time, this commander in chief, who has this enormous responsibility over the international community, also has all of the domestic policy of this country under their purview. Most often, we think of that in terms of economic issues, but increasingly in the US, it's social issues, it's civil rights issues, it's healthcare issues, it's education issues, these enormous tasks. And balancing both of these things, America's international footprint and foreign policy and America's domestic policy, it's too much realistically for one person to do both well and to focus on and to be strategic on. A president is too often running from one crisis to the next to respond to the short term emergencies and not giving very much thought to the big picture and the long term footprint of America's policies and our objectives and our ideas and what we want to shape America's best interests to be. This also leaves other countries in the world who have leaders who are more focused on one aspect or another of their country. It allows them to think longer term, and increasingly to think longer term without considering America's position on the assumption that America doesn't have one. Now, I would offer that when it comes to international affairs and domestic affairs, the U.S. is unique in that our powerhouse economy and our domestic policy that enables our position in the world as an economic leader is the very thing that makes us powerful on the international stage. If we didn't have the dynamic, robust, and explosive economy that we have, we wouldn't be able to project power around the world with both our culture and other soft power, of course, and our hard power, our military, our diplomatic corps, our funding structures, our ability to influence policy anywhere in the world. One predicates the other. And so, in that regard, the American presidency is valuable in some ways to have both of those things together, because if we were to struggle economically in a fundamental way, it may then result in a weakened America on the international stage, which some would argue has already occurred in recent decades. So, I'm curious what you all think in this audience. It is my view that the American presidency has become so unwieldy on these issues of international and domestic affairs. As given a great example right now, you look at how much time and attention that President Biden has to focus on an international issue like the war in Ukraine and the implications that that has for the NATO alliance, for Eastern Europe, for the rest of Europe, for the entire international community, these massive economic disruptions and food supply and fuel supply disruptions. This has international implications. It should be something that the American president is focused on. But if they're focused on that, are they taking their eye off the ball on other important economic issues? Is it really sufficient to just build out a cabinet of capable leaders? In other countries, we'd call them ministers, who oversee things like the State Department, like the Defense Department, like our the Secretary of the Department of Transportation, Secretary of Health and Human Services, Secretary of the Treasury. Is it enough to delegate that power to those individuals, or do you actually need leaders, elected leaders, importantly, who are overseeing the shop at home and another who's overseeing the head of state duties. I think it's asking an awful lot of any president of any age to do both at the same time. Now, I'm not suggesting you fundamentally have to split the presidency in two and elect two offices. What I'm suggesting is perhaps there's more domestic policy decisions that should be made by the vice president, considering that person is an elected officer. And perhaps the president should play more of a role as head of state most of the time. Perhaps there is a value in having other areas of government take on more responsibilities. So, look, traditionally, Congress should play a huge role in determining America's foreign policy position, and yet so often it's become just an advisory role with little actual responsibility. Perhaps we need to have a little bit more of that responsibility in the Congress. I would also argue that delegating some power back to the states is a good idea. Does the American president really need to be involved in all kinds of national issues that can and probably should be adjudicated at the state level? Now, we'd all have to start thinking about what those issues are. But for instance, it's hard to argue that you could ever come up with an education policy that will apply to all 50 states and territories. That while the federal government does need to have some hand in the general funding of our system, the idea that an education policy could possibly meet the needs of a New York public school system as well as it meets the needs of a rural Wyoming school system is laughable on the face of it. These states are fundamentally different, the communities are fundamentally different, and while there is some value, important value, in having curriculum that bonds us all together as Americans, it's also important to recognize how diverse the country is geographically, regionally, culturally, and to allow some of those decisions to be made at the more local level and not have as much government intervention and interference. Now, my other consideration about the presidency, aside from the mixing of international and domestic policy, is the key distinction between what issues a president should weigh in on and what issues a president perhaps doesn't need to take as much of a role into. So, a lot of us think about the presidency as a position of great authority with the bully pulpit to move America's opinion. And that's true, but we can't move America's opinion on everything. We have to have some focus. I think it's been an interesting couple of decades with the American president, whoever it is, weighing in on different issues depending on the individual themselves and their ability and their qualification to speak to those issues. For 8 years during the Obama administration, we had a president who could talk about civil rights from a unique point of view, somebody who's lived it, somebody who's been on the receiving end of prejudice, of potentially harmful insinuations and opinions about who they are, where they're coming from, what they're doing, somebody who suffered that while they were in office. But is that really a topic that every American president will be able to speak to and talk about with any real authority? Probably not. We had a president who had some background as a governor. We've had many presidents with a background as a governor. So perhaps they were more capable of speaking about issues at the state level and the distinction between what can be done at the federal and what can be done at the state. But not every president has the governor's mindset or a governor's background. Some presidents, like our current president, come from a legislative background, as did several former presidents. And so they're more able to speak about the legislative process, what's achievable, what's not. But not every president can do that. Not every president's going to have that background. So even when we think about what the qualifications for the office are and how those qualifications enable the president to speak with authority on important topics and issues, as you think about the difference between presidents, does that change what those presidents can speak about just because the person has changed but the office has not? I think increasingly the American president is being asked, like many chief executives of companies around the country, to weigh in on issues well outside their expertise and potentially on issues that are well outside their ability to have any positive impact on because they just don't have the experience and their office carries a unique weight that may actually inflame issues rather than put them at the center of our discussion. And finally, we have to talk about the role of the American president in our political landscape. That it's odd in some ways that once elected president, somebody is supposed to represent all of the people of the country, irregardless of what party they come from. And yet they're still the head of just one of America's two major political parties, which means they spend a good portion of their time both running for reelection, helping other people in their party get elected or reelected, raising money for their party, and actively bashing the other party. The very nature of a president being from a political party, that this is a partisan position that remains partisan through the term in office, also diminishes to some degree the impact that that office can have, because half the country, more or less, or at least 40%, they're just tuning you out because you're not, quote unquote, their president. You're the president, but you're not their president. And if we continue to have the political divisions that we have in this country, as many countries around the world have, and the person who is in that seat is both the chief executive for all domestic federal issues, but also the head of state for all international issues, that is a very hard position, in my view, to have as a partisan seat that is looked through partisan lens. This is where I think Americans would appreciate the ability to elect one leader to be head of state and one leader to be head of the executive branch for domestic policy issues. I know many Americans who have, let's call them, more left of center point of views as they pertain to domestic matters, but they have a more conservative, robust global foreign policy perspective. And conversely, others who may have more of a low regulation, low taxation posture towards the American economy and other domestic issues, but internationally, they're very concerned about America's place in conflicts. And they don't really like America's footprint around the world. They would view these two gargantuan issues in two different ways. And we could very possibly have a country with a head of state that had a more left of center position, we'll call it, but a domestic leader who had more of a right of center, or vice versa. There are times where America's foreign policy becomes much more robust, and then times where, at the very same time, our domestic policy becomes more of a social good, and the focus is on how we take care of the American public economically, healthcare, education, jobs, justice, all of these important domestic issues. By electing a president that we both have to deal with foreign policy issues and domestic policies, we as Americans are often having to choose between these two things that we don't necessarily view through the same light. And we're always having to compromise by electing somebody who we disagree with on a great number of our issues. And we won't even get into the topic of independent candidates and lack thereof, and the lack of third parties. These are just some of the considerations of the American presidency. So my conclusion of this, and now what I ask you all to come back to me with some of your thoughts and ideas, is, do you believe the American presidency, as we celebrate this President's Day week here in the U.S., from our domestic audience, I'd like to know from you, do you feel as I do that this office has become hopelessly unwieldy? That we as Americans are constantly having to elect somebody that couldn't possibly be qualified to do all aspects of this job, and that we would like to be able to split our votes between the issues of foreign policy and the issues of domestic policy, the issues that come with being a head of state versus the issues that come with being a chief executive. These are fundamentally different things. And I think it would be very valuable for us to see a change in our election system that allows us to have more than one vote on these particularly critical issues and how we might perceive them and view them. Internationally, I'd love to hear from others about whether you agree with me that how America elects its president has a huge implication for countries around the world. And if it would be perceived as being something better or more consistent for America to produce a head of state that was international facing and focused more consistently, and then having somebody more focused domestically. Would that be something that would actually help move international policy forward and allow America to sometimes split the difference between what it wants domestically and what its people want to do internationally? And then I want to throw out to all of you out there who have a more political view of these things. Do you feel that an office as powerful as this should be left to the confines of partisan politics, or should these elections be run in a nonpartisan way? And the Republicans and the Democrats can put forward whoever they want, and independents can put forward whoever they want. But why should we have to choose through a primary process and a general process a seat that is supposed to represent everybody? And if the person who wins that office is beholden to just one party, to raise money for that party, to be the face of that party, can that ever possibly produce the kind of results that we're going to want as a public, as a body politic? Or will we always be electing somebody who's just going to be thinking about how to advance the interests of their party ahead of the interests of the country as a whole, unable or unwilling to compromise in a way that many of us might be willing to because we put country over party? I hope I've given you all some things to think about today, and I want to hear back from you because this only works if I hear back from what you all think. So, one more time, if you'd like to email me your thoughts on the American presidency and what it is and what it can be and what it should be, info at brianjmatos.com. Tweet me. You can direct message me. You can send me a public tweet at Brian J. Matos. Find me on Facebook, brian.matos. If you're more of an Instagram user, Brian J. Matos on Instagram. I've had people send me messages through images. And then I intend to post this to YouTube at Brian J. Matos Podcast. You can leave a comment in that video. Reach out to me. I want to hear from you. Next week, we'll take some of those emails, some of those messages, some of those tweets. If you have any questions or clarifications, I'd be happy to deal with those. And then in the weeks to come, we're looking forward to booking some great guests. So stick with the podcast. Subscribe to us if you haven't already. Wherever you get your favorite podcasts, our show is available. And if you're looking for the latest content, written, verbal, or otherwise, brianjmatos.com is the place to go. I post new content there every week, whenever at all possible. And I look forward to hearing from you all soon. I look forward to talking to you again. Have a great week. We'll talk again soon.